When the largest technology conglomerate on the planet is forced to retract its own digital timestamp, the entire foundation of a criminal investigation crumbles. Imagine looking at a server log that definitively places a masked suspect at a crime scene on January 11th. Investigators build their entire theory around this single piece of data. They assume premeditation. They assume a calculated trial run by a highly organized predator. But then the physical evidence tells a completely different story, pointing directly to the early hours of February 1st. What happens when the cloud data fundamentally contradicts reality? This is not a simple glitch in a routine server sync. This is a fatal flaw that completely breaks the timeline of an active abduction and leaves law enforcement chasing a digital ghost. We rely heavily on smart home cameras and cloud storage to keep us safe, and to record the absolute truth when no one else is watching. But in this specific investigation, the recorded truth was a dangerous illusion. The massive discrepancy between January 11th and February 1st is not just a minor technical error. It is the absolute core mystery of a complex case that has completely baffled the Federal Bureau of Investigation and local authorities alike. When digital forensics fail, the physical evidence is the only thing that remains. But what if the physical evidence leads to an absolute dead end? Digital forensics can break a case, but only if the data does not lie. If you want clinical fact-based investigations that cut through the media noise, subscribe to True Crime with Liam and turn on notifications. We dissect the forensic evidence step by step, leaving absolutely no room for internet rumors or baseless speculation. The chilling case we are examining today exposes the terrifying fragility of our modern security systems. A prominent family is left, desperate for answers, while a masked suspect vanishes seamlessly into the dark gap between digital memory and physical reality. The official timeline is irrevocably fractured. The foundational data is severely compromised, and an 84-year-old woman is simply gone without a trace. To understand exactly how the system failed so catastrophically, we must first examine the specific environment where the crime took place. It is a place that carefully projects an image of total, impenetrable security. But as the server logs eventually proved, security is often just a comforting lie. The Catalina Foothills region of Tucson, Arizona, is meticulously designed to keep the unpredictable outside world at a comfortable distance. It is a highly affluent enclave, characterized by sprawling desert properties, long winding driveways, and an overwhelming sense of deep isolation disguised perfectly as privacy. Residents willingly pay a massive premium for this quiet detachment. 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie resided alone in one of these secluded homes. She was not merely an elderly woman living quietly. She was unknowingly a high-value target. As the mother of prominent national television anchor Savannah Guthrie, her life existed closely adjacent to intense public scrutiny, even if her daily routine was exceptionally private. This specific dynamic created a deeply unique vulnerability. Prominent status often attracts unwanted attention, and severe isolation provides the absolute perfect environment for that attention to eventually manifest into something incredibly dangerous. On the cool evening of January 31st at exactly 9:50 p.m., the quiet routine of the Catalina Foothills was momentarily broken by the arrival of a familiar vehicle. Nancy Guthrie was being dropped off safely at her residence by her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni. This specific chronological timestamp is absolutely crucial to the investigation. It serves as the final, definitively confirmed moment that she was seen alive and completely unharmed. Cioni watched carefully as she entered the dark home. The interaction was reportedly entirely unremarkable in every single way. It was just a standard family drop-off following a completely normal evening out. But in complex forensic investigations, the most unremarkable moments are frequently the most critical because they firmly establish the final baseline before the violent disruption occurs. 9:50 p.m. serves as the final anchor point of undisputed reality before the digital timeline completely shatters. After Cioni finally departed, the large house quickly returned to its perpetually quiet state. Nancy Guthrie was now completely alone in a sprawling property secured only by locked doors and standard modern surveillance technology. She had absolutely every reason to believe she was completely safe from harm. The entire surrounding environment was specifically engineered to foster that exact comforting belief. High-end residential neighborhoods in Tucson rely heavily on the psychological deterrence factor. The prevailing assumption is that the visible presence of smart security cameras and the physical distance from the busy main roads are more than enough to stop a crime long before it actually begins. But psychological deterrence only works on disorganized, opportunistic criminals. It does absolutely nothing to stop a methodical individual who has specifically chosen a high-profile target and carefully planned their precise approach. The deep quiet of the house that night was not a genuine sign of true safety. It was merely the temporary absence of immediate noise. As the late-night minutes slowly ticked past 10 p.m., the outer perimeter of the solitary home remained perfectly still. The heavy wooden doors were locked tight. The smart doorbell camera was active and presumably recording the empty porch. Nancy Guthrie likely went about her normal evening routine, entirely unaware that her home had already been fundamentally compromised. We lock our doors to convince ourselves that we retain control over who enters our personal space. But that control is a dangerous illusion when a highly organized predator is actively willing to dismantle the security infrastructure. The sharp metallic sound of the deadbolt sliding securely into place at 9:50 p.m. was the final, normal sound to echo through the silent house. She truly thought she was safe in her quiet neighborhood, but she did not know that the very concept of safety in that house had already been completely neutralized. The transition from normal routine to active crime scene is often abrupt and defined by the sudden absence of expected behavior. For Nancy Guthrie, that absence became glaringly obvious on the late morning of February 1st. She was a woman of habit, deeply integrated into her local community. When she completely failed to appear for her regular Sunday church service, her absence immediately triggered alarm bells among her relatives. People who live highly structured lives do not simply vanish without notifying someone. At exactly 11:56 a.m., concerned family members arrived at the Catalina Foothills property to check on her well-being. They expected to find her, perhaps feeling unwell or simply running late. Instead, they discovered a severely disrupted environment that instantly shattered any hope of a simple misunderstanding. The physical state of the residence told a violent and chaotic story that starkly contrasted with the quiet isolation of the neighborhood. The interior of the home was not pristine. It was a disrupted scene that strongly indicated a sudden struggle had taken place. At exactly 12:03 p.m., a frantic call was placed to 911. This call officially initiated the massive response from the Pima County Sheriff's Department. The transition from a simple welfare check to a major criminal investigation occurred in a matter of just 7 minutes. When local law enforcement arrived at the property, they immediately began to secure the perimeter and process the scene for physical evidence. The initial sweep of the residence yielded a chilling discovery that completely changed the trajectory of the response. Near the front entrance of the home, investigators located distinct physical evidence. They found forensic biological evidence, specifically bloodstains pooled on the ground. This discovery instantly elevated the situation from a standard missing persons report to an active investigation of a violent crime. The presence of blood at the primary point of entry or exit is a critical forensic indicator. It strongly suggests that the victim sustained a severe injury precisely at the boundary between the perceived safety of the home and the vulnerability of the outside world. Samples of the biological evidence were immediately collected and rushed to the crime laboratory for rapid forensic analysis. The primary objective was to definitively establish the origin of the bloodstains. The results from the laboratory testing confirmed the worst possible fears of the family and the local investigators. The extracted profile from the bloodstains was an absolute definitive match to 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie. This confirmed forensic match totally eradicated any lingering theory that she had simply wandered off or experienced a standard medical emergency. The blood proved conclusively that she was the victim of a violent physical assault right at her own front door. The investigation was no longer about finding a lost elderly woman. It was now a desperate, high-stakes manhunt for a violent perpetrator who had successfully breached a secure home, assaulted the resident, and removed her from the premises without drawing any attention from the surrounding neighbors. The silence of the affluent neighborhood during the violent attack became a deeply disturbing factor. How exactly does a violent physical struggle occur at the front entrance of a large home without a single witness hearing a scream or noticing a major disturbance? This indicated that the alleged attacker was highly efficient, fast, and incredibly quiet. They controlled the environment, and they controlled the victim. The forensic blood match was the undeniable proof of a targeted abduction. Law enforcement systematically cordoned off the property, transforming the quiet desert home into a heavily guarded grid. The investigators knew that whoever committed this act had to have left a physical footprint behind. A violent struggle inevitably results in the transfer of material. They searched for any anomaly that did not belong to the victim. The blood at the door confirmed that this was indeed a violent crime, and the suspected attacker had made a critical move right before the violent event unfolded that would momentarily shift the entire focus of the intense investigation. Modern investigations rely heavily on the digital eyes that surround our properties. The investigators at the Catalina Foothills home immediately turned their attention to the smart doorbell camera, mounted directly near the location of the bloodstains. They anticipated finding clear, high-definition footage of the entire violent abduction. But what they discovered was a calculated act of digital sabotage that completely altered the profile of the suspect. They extracted the stored video files, hoping to capture the moment of the attack. Instead, the most critical piece of footage they recovered was time-stamped at exactly 1:47 am on February 1st. This was nearly 4 hours after Nancy Guthrie was dropped off by her son-in-law. The footage did not show a spontaneous burglary or a random opportunistic crime. It showed a chillingly methodical sequence of events, executed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The video displayed an unidentified individual approaching the front door. The suspect was completely obscured from head to toe, leaving absolutely no exposed skin or identifiable facial features. They wore a heavy ski mask specifically designed to defeat facial recognition technology and obscure their identity from the high-definition lens. Their hands were covered by thick gloves, ensuring that absolutely no fingerprints or trace DNA would be left on the camera housing or the surrounding door frame. This was not an amateur. This was someone severely disciplined in the art of forensic countermeasures. The masked figure carried a backpack, suggesting they brought specific tools to facilitate the breach or the abduction. Most alarmingly, the footage clearly showed what appeared to be an armed suspect carrying a holstered weapon. The presence of a weapon instantly confirmed the lethal threat level of the individual. This armed and masked suspect did not attempt to pick the lock or break the glass. They walked directly toward the lens with a singular, focused objective. They reached up and physically tampered with the smart doorbell, violently disconnecting the camera from its power source and severing its connection to the cloud network. The screen abruptly went black. The act of blinding the security system at exactly 1:47 a.m. was a highly aggressive and incredibly calculated maneuver. It demonstrated that the alleged perpetrator had a deep understanding of residential security infrastructure. They knew the exact field of view of the lens, and they knew exactly how to neutralize it before initiating the primary phase of the attack. By physically severing the connection, the suspect ensured that whatever happened next, the actual abduction, the struggle that caused the bloodstains would occur in total unrecorded darkness. The investigators now had a very specific physical description of their suspect, an armed individual in a ski mask with a backpack and gloves operating at 1:47 a.m. This was a massive breakthrough. They had the exact time the perimeter was breached, and they had visual confirmation of the sophisticated nature of the threat. The local authorities believed they had locked down the definitive timeline of the crime. The assumption was clear. The suspect disabled the camera at 1:47 a.m. breached. The residents assaulted Nancy Guthrie and abducted her under the cover of the desert night. The case seemed incredibly straightforward from a timeline perspective. Law enforcement prepared to release this critical timestamp to the public to track the movements of the suspect leading up to the early hours of February 1st. They packaged the digital evidence and submitted it to the cloud service provider for deep server verification. It was supposed to be a routine digital confirmation to solidify the official timeline before moving forward with the massive manhunt. But when the massive tech company processed the request and returned the server data, the entire investigation hit a massive, impenetrable wall. The results from the cloud servers completely contradicted the established reality of the crime scene. The data completely broke the timeline. If you want to see exactly how investigators handle cases where the digital evidence completely contradicts the physical facts, subscribe to True Crime with Liam and turn on the notification bell right now. The investigation was now operating under immense pressure and rapidly evolving complexities. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos took the lead in navigating the massive influx of forensic data and media scrutiny. With the victim being the mother of a prominent national television personality, the resources allocated to the case were vast, but the margins for error were absolutely zero. Sheriff Nanos directed his teams to employ an incredibly methodical approach, focusing entirely on the immutable physical evidence left behind at the disrupted scene. While the digital timeline was facing unprecedented complications, the physical forensics teams were diligently processing the biological material recovered from the residence. Their meticulous efforts yielded a deeply significant discovery. Mixed among the bloodstains at the front entrance, technicians isolated a microscopic trace of unidentified biological material. This was forensic gold. The extracted profile did not belong to Nancy Guthrie, and it did not belong to any known members of her immediate family. Investigators possessed the genetic blueprint of an unknown individual who was present at the exact location of the violent struggle. Standard protocol dictated that this unidentified profile be immediately uploaded and compared against the vast federal database known as the Combined DNA Index System. Investigators anxiously awaited a rapid hit that would instantly identify their masked suspect. However, the federal database returned a completely negative result. The suspect was a total ghost in the fighting system, with absolutely no prior felony convictions that would require their genetic material to be on file. This severe lack of a database match forced the investigative team to pivot to a much more complex and time-consuming forensic strategy. They officially initiated the process of investigative genetic genealogy. This highly advanced technique involves uploading the unknown genetic profile to commercial genealogy databases to identify distant relatives and painstakingly build out a massive family tree to eventually pinpoint the unknown suspect. While investigative genetic genealogy is incredibly powerful, it is also agonizingly slow. It requires months of dedicated genealogical research, and the investigators simply did not have the luxury of time. As the complex genealogy process slowly began in the background, local search and rescue teams heavily scoured the desolate areas surrounding the Catalina Foothills. Their wide grid searches were designed to locate any discarded items that the suspect may have tossed away while fleeing the immediate area. During these extensive searches, a seemingly massive breakthrough occurred. Approximately 2 miles from the location of the primary crime scene, search teams discovered a pair of discarded gloves. Given that the camera footage clearly showed the masked suspect wearing thick gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, this discovery was immediately treated as a critical piece of physical evidence. The location of the gloves perfectly aligned with a potential escape route, heavily suggesting that the suspect had removed them while rushing away from the affluent neighborhood. The gloves were carefully collected and rushed to the crime laboratory for priority biological testing. The investigators firmly believed they had finally captured the physical items worn by the attacker during the violent abduction. They fully expected the laboratory to extract a genetic profile that would perfectly match the unidentified biological material found near the bloodstains at the front door. For a brief moment, it appeared that traditional physical forensics were about to rapidly solve the massive case. The investigative team waited anxiously for the definitive laboratory results to confirm the critical link. But forensic science is entirely objective, and it does not bend to the desperate hopes of law enforcement. When the comprehensive laboratory report was finally completed, the results were deeply disappointing. The advanced genetic testing completely ruled out any connection to the violent crime. The biological material extracted from the inside of the discarded gloves did not match the unknown profile found at the crime scene. In fact, the trace evidence led the investigators in a completely different and utterly irrelevant direction. The rigorous testing positively traced the discarded gloves back to a completely innocent local restaurant worker who had simply lost them in the desert area. It was an incredibly frustrating false positive that wasted valuable time and crucial resources. The traditional physical evidence was rapidly leading to absolute dead ends. The discarded items were completely useless, and the genetic genealogy analysis would take countless weeks to produce any actionable leads. The intense media pressure continued to rapidly mount, and Sheriff Chris Nanos and his highly dedicated team were fundamentally forced to rely entirely on the absolute most confusing and deeply contradictory piece of evidence in their possession. They had absolutely no other choice but to confront the glaring digital anomaly. The physical trails had completely gone cold, forcing the entire massive investigation to hinge exclusively on the deeply flawed data extracted from the masked suspect's calculated interaction with the smart security camera. When a local jurisdiction hits a catastrophic dead end, the entire nature of the inquiry fundamentally transforms. The involvement of the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately elevated the search parameters from a regional emergency to a nationwide crisis. Federal agents do not typically deploy their elite resources for simple domestic disputes or random acts of trespassing. Their arrival signals a definitive categorization of the event. The working theory among the top behavioral analysts and tactical commanders completely shifted away from an opportunistic burglary gone wrong. The sheer lack of physical trace evidence left behind, coupled with the aggressive blinding of the surveillance perimeter, pointed to a deeply disturbing conclusion. This was an operation meticulously orchestrated by highly disciplined individuals. To execute a forced extraction of a target without triggering a single neighborhood alarm requires extensive pre-operational surveillance and an intimate understanding of tactical blind spots. The authorities were no longer hunting a desperate criminal looking for quick cash. They were actively pursuing a sophisticated syndicate or a highly trained individual operating with a very specific, deeply concealed agenda. To flush out suspects with this level of operational security, law enforcement relies on the most powerful leverage available. They authorized a staggering financial incentive to break the silence. A heavily publicized reward of $1 million was officially established and broadcast across every major news network in the country. In the vast majority of criminal enterprises, a seven-figure payout is the ultimate destructive force. It is enough money to make loyalties crumble. It is enough money to make accomplices turn on their partners and anonymously dial the federal tip line. The investigative task force fully anticipated a massive influx of actionable intelligence. They braced for the inevitable ransom demand that historically accompanies the capture of a target linked to a prominent national figure. The conventional playbook for high-value abductions dictates that the perpetrators will establish communication to monetize their massive risk. But the days turned into weeks, and the dedicated phone lines remained completely dead. The investigators faced an absolutely deafening silence that defied every standard behavioral model. Despite the massive fortune sitting on the table, not a single credible ransom note was delivered. There were no encrypted emails. There were no anonymous phone calls demanding a wire transfer. And most terrifyingly, there was absolutely no proof of life presented to the desperate family. This chilling absence of communication introduced a deeply sinister complication into the war room. If the objective of the tactical breach was not financial extortion, the alternative motives become exponentially darker. Criminals who take massive risks without demanding a massive payout are operating on a psychological wavelength that is incredibly difficult to predict or negotiate with. They are driven by personal vendettas, ideological fanaticism, or entirely incomprehensible psychological compulsions. The failure of the $1 million reward to generate a single valid lead essentially confirmed that the tactical teams were dealing with an apex predator who valued their silent objective far more than a lifetime of financial security. The entire federal apparatus was effectively paralyzed by the total lack of demands. They had an empty house, a massive reward, and absolutely no one stepping out of the shadows to claim it. The profound silence from the captors forced the behavioral analysts to completely discard their standard hostage negotiation protocols. They were flying completely blind in a scenario where the usual rules of criminal engagement simply did not apply. This is the exact moment where the psychological dread truly begins to suffocate an investigation. When the motive is entirely invisible, the threat becomes omnipresent. The authorities realized that applying conventional pressure tactics was completely useless against an entity that refused to communicate. The sheer discipline required to maintain absolute radio silence, while the entire country is actively hunting you, is a terrifying indicator of the perpetrator's mental fortitude. They were entirely unaffected by the intense media saturation and the massive financial temptations. The investigators had to painstakingly reevaluate every single assumption they had made about the tactical breach. If financial gain was entirely off the table, the focus had to shift toward extreme personal grievance or a highly specialized contract operation. But investigating those avenues requires a starting point, and the silent captors provided absolutely nothing. The war room was filled with the top minds in criminal behavior, yet they were collectively staring at a massive void. The longer the silence persisted, the more the agonizing reality settled in. This was not a negotiation. It was a complete and total erasure. The captors did not want money because their primary goal had already been successfully achieved the moment they vanished into the desert night. What do you think is the motive for a deeply orchestrated kidnapping with absolutely no ransom demand? Leave a comment below with your forensic analysis of this terrifyingly silent tactic. With the conventional extortion theories completely collapsing under the weight of the unexplained silence, the investigative task force was forced to pivot aggressively back to the only tangible asset they possessed. They directed their entire analytical focus toward the extracted digital logs secured from the corporate servers of the smart home technology provider. The actual video files had been physically severed, but the metadata residing deep within the cloud infrastructure held the promise of revealing the digital footprints of the masked intruder. When the highly anticipated technical report finally arrived from the corporate headquarters, it contained a revelation that sent immediate shockwaves through the entire command center. The internal server logs fundamentally contradicted the visual narrative that the local authorities had been operating under. The official corporate data definitively stated that the specific video file capturing the heavily disguised individual approaching the front porch was not generated on the chaotic night of the disappearance. The deeply embedded cloud timestamp unequivocally registered the exact date as January 11th. This single line of digital code instantly detonated the established timeline. It meant that exactly 3 weeks before the violent physical struggle occurred, the armed suspect had brazenly walked right up to the front door. This was the ultimate confirmation of a deeply disturbing theory. The suspect had executed a highly calculated trial run. They had actively stalked the property, tested the perimeter defenses, and gauged the reaction times of the internal security networks long before they ever decided to strike. The psychological impact of this specific data point was absolutely devastating. It proved that the target was living under active hostile surveillance for nearly a month, entirely unaware that a predator was studying her every move. The federal agents immediately mobilized massive resources based on this new corporate intelligence. They began aggressively drafting sweeping subpoenas for cellular tower dumps and traffic camera archives, focusing entirely on the weeks leading up to January 11th. The entire investigative strategy was comprehensively redesigned to hunt down a methodical stalker rather than a spontaneous attacker. They believed they had finally found the critical tactical error made by the sophisticated syndicate. But in the realm of complex digital forensics, absolute certainty is often a very dangerous illusion. Just as the massive federal dragnet was being officially deployed based on the January 11th hypothesis, a catastrophic development completely shattered the momentum. The massive technology conglomerate issued a sudden and highly urgent retraction. The corporate legal team and their senior software engineers contacted the lead investigators to walk back their previous definitive statement. They officially claimed that the server logs had suffered a massive synchronization error within their cloud architecture. The company stated that rolling updates to their global network had caused data packets to misalign, creating an entirely false digital timestamp for the crucial video file. The January 11th date, they argued, was nothing more than a ghost in the machine generated by a purely technical malfunction rather than human activity. This sudden corporate reversal was an absolute disaster for the entire prosecution strategy. The foundation of their premeditation theory was completely obliterated in a matter of minutes. The investigators were forced to confront a deeply terrifying reality. The digital evidence they relied upon to solve the most complex cases was fundamentally unstable. If a multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate could not definitively verify the basic chronology of their own server data, how could any prosecutor ever present that information to a jury with a straight face? The timeline was entirely torn apart, leaving the authorities completely stranded in a massive forensic void. The suspect had not only evaded the physical dragnet, but had also inadvertently benefited from a massive corporate system failure. The very technology designed to capture the truth had actively manufactured a lie, completely destroying weeks of intense investigative labor. The fallout from this digital retraction was incredibly profound. It severely compromised the integrity of the entire digital perimeter. Every single piece of cloud-based evidence was suddenly viewed with intense skepticism. The detectives had built a massive psychological profile based on the patience and discipline required to conduct a 3-week surveillance operation. Now, they had to completely scrap that profile because the corporate servers could not distinguish between a system glitch and a physical intruder. The defense, attorneys in future cases would absolutely weaponize this corporate admission of technical incompetence to cast reasonable doubt on any cloud-based evidence. The authorities were left entirely empty-handed, staring at a timeline that was now completely fluid and legally unusable. The masked figure was no longer a stalker from January. They were simply an unknown entity existing in a state of permanent temporal ambiguity. Like the video right now, if you clearly see the extreme danger of this specific digital loophole and want us to continue exposing these catastrophic system failures, the immediate aftermath of the retracted corporate data plunged the entire investigation into an incredibly dark and stagnant phase. The task force had essentially exhausted every single available avenue of rapid pursuit. The physical trails had evaporated in the desert dirt, and the digital pathways had collapsed into a mess of corrupted server logs. The harsh reality of the situation began to settle over the command center with a heavy, suffocating weight. The fundamental objective of the entire operation remained brutally unresolved. The elderly victim was still entirely unaccounted for. Despite the massive deployment of federal assets, the utilization of advanced aerial surveillance, and the exhaustive grid searches of the surrounding topography, there was absolutely no sign of her. The profound gap between the intense media spectacle surrounding the case and the agonizingly slow pace of the actual forensic reality became glaringly obvious. On the national television broadcasts, the story was updated hourly, with intense speculation and dramatic commentary focusing heavily on the high-profile familial connections. But inside the secure briefing rooms, the whiteboards remained tragically empty. The investigative teams were trapped in a state of forced inactivity, entirely dependent on the incredibly slow scientific processes that were still running in the background. The only remaining thread of legitimate hope was tied to the complex investigative genetic genealogy analysis. But mapping out distant family trees using microscopic biological trace evidence is a process measured in many months, not hours. The immense public pressure demanded immediate results and swift justice, but the absolute limitations of modern science strictly dictated a grueling waiting game. The detectives were forced to endure the agonizing daily routine of chasing down utterly baseless tips generated by the relentless media coverage while knowing that their primary leads were completely dead. The suspect had successfully executed what appeared to be the perfect crime, not through absolute flawless planning, but by simply capitalizing on the inherent weaknesses of the modern surveillance state. They walked directly into the view of a high-definition camera and manipulated it just enough to let the corporate cloud architecture destroy the evidence for them. They vanished into the massive blind spots that exist just beyond the reach of our supposedly omnipotent digital networks. The neighborhood returned to its quiet, isolated state, but the psychological damage was entirely permanent. The sprawling residential areas were no longer perceived as safe havens. They were exposed as highly vulnerable enclosures, where a motivated individual could strike with absolute impunity and simply walk away. The case descended into a frustrating limbo, heavily shadowed by the agonizing uncertainty of the victim's ultimate fate. The passage of time is the absolute greatest enemy of any active abduction investigation. Every single day that passes, without a confirmed sighting or a verified communication, exponentially decreases the probability of a safe recovery. The federal agents slowly began to scale back their visible presence in the affluent community, transitioning the active tactical hunt into a cold analytical review of the heavily corrupted files. The bright camera lights of the national press eventually moved on to the next breaking tragedy, leaving the local authorities to manage the devastating quiet. The fundamental question of what exactly occurred in the early hours of that morning remains heavily obscured by the catastrophic failure of the digital infrastructure. The suspect managed to slip through the rapidly closing net, not by outrunning the police, but by fundamentally outsmarting the technology that was supposed to trap them. They exploited the massive gap between physical reality and cloud storage, effectively erasing their own presence from the historical record. Authorities are perpetually waiting for the genetic results, knowing that even a positive match might come far too late to change the tragic outcome. The silence of the desert swallowed the absolute truth whole, leaving behind only a heavily fractured timeline and a permanently empty, quiet house. What? This deeply unsettling case teaches us about the extreme fragility of modern security is absolutely vital for anyone relying on smart home technology. We willingly trade our personal privacy for the comforting illusion of total control, heavily assuming that a digital camera mounted on the front porch acts as an impenetrable shield. But this investigation proves that these devices do not prevent violent crimes. They merely observe them, and sometimes they observe them entirely incorrectly. When we analyze the fundamental differences between digital forensics and traditional physical evidence, a terrifying reality emerges. A. Cloud-based timestamp is never an absolute truth in a court of law, unless it is rigorously backed by unassailable server architecture. Data can be heavily corrupted, seamlessly manipulated, or entirely lost due to routine corporate synchronization. Errors. Relying exclusively on binary code to build a legal prosecution is an incredibly dangerous strategy. Investigators must always strictly cross-reference digital logs with immutable physical evidence like biological material or structural damage. The complete failure of the corporate servers in this specific instance completely paralyzed a massive federal response, demonstrating exactly how vulnerable our justice system is to minor technological glitches. The heavily marketed promise of total digital security is frequently a corporate fabrication designed to sell hardware. Determined predators know exactly how to operate in the dark spaces between the network nodes, using our profound over-reliance on technology against us. This critical case perfectly highlights the absolute necessity of maintaining robust physical security measures. When the digital eyes are completely blinded by a sudden system failure, the physical barriers are the only remaining line of defense standing against the violent unknown. We must fundamentally rethink our entire approach to personal safety before we become the next data error in a cold case file. The investigation remains entirely open, heavily bogged down by the devastating lack of reliable digital footprints and the agonizingly slow pace of genealogical science. The affluent neighborhood has returned to its quiet, isolated routines, but the permanent scars of that violent night remain deeply visible to anyone who looks closely. A prominent family continues to wait for answers that may never actually arrive, trapped in a perpetual state of agonizing grief and confusion. The masked suspect remains completely unidentified, successfully evading one of the most intense federal manhunts in recent history by simply letting the modern security infrastructure completely collapse in on itself. As we review the heavily corrupted files and the empty desert landscapes, we are forced to confront a deeply unsettling reality about our modern existence. If even the massive data servers in the cloud can be fundamentally distorted and proven entirely false, what is the only real tangible trace we actually leave behind in this world when the power is finally cut? Subscribe to True Crime with Liam right now, because next week we are actively decoding another terrifying case where a single deleted text message completely dismantled an entire homicide trial. You absolutely do not want to miss this.